Hey, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Hoppy. Today's episode is about bearing witness. Now, I know the word witness probably conjures up images of someone testifying in a court of law, but today we're talking about the radical pleasure of watching. Witnessing sex can be transformative, not just for the person that's doing the watching, but also for those who are being watched. And that's because the act itself shatters all that stigma and shame that tells us as queer men to keep our sex behind closed doors, out of sight, out of mind. And for today's guest, witnessing can also be a form of sex education. Sister Tana Virgin is a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, a nonprofit group of queer nuns that began in San Francisco all the way back in 1979. And you may recognize their kind of campy, irreverent style with those nun habits that you'll see if you're watching the episode. They work to, quote, promulgate universal joy and expiate stigmatic guilt. Through their ministry of presence, community service, and groundbreaking efforts like creating the first ever safer sex pamphlet targeting gay men, the sisters have become icons globally when it comes to queer activism and sex positivity. In this episode, Sister Tana Virgin explains how watching has shaped her understanding of pleasure, connection, and queer liberation. Let's listen in. Sister Tana Virgin, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to have you. And tell listeners and viewers a little bit about the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, because they're going to be looking at you, and some will be familiar, but some won't be. So let's just start there.
Great, yeah. So the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence is a nonprofit organization that started here in San Francisco in 1979. We just celebrated our 45th anniversary.
Awesome.
As sisters, we take vows to the community to promulgate universal joy and to expiate stigmatic guilt. We do that through various forms of community service, social fundraising, engagement with the community. Our main thing is our ministry of presence, which is just kind of putting on these fabulous habits and then going out into the community and kind of being ministers within the community. We're non-denominational, and each sister kind of has their own ministry that they feel called to do, that we also kind of interlap in a lot of different ways.
And there's kind of a sex positive origin story to that, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The sisters, again, kind of founded and really rallied together, primarily as initially some gay men who were kind of tired with the fact that the government really wasn't stepping up in any capacity for the early stages of the AIDS epidemic. And so we kind of started helping ourselves out, and we did that through our kind of social activism. The sisters put together the first ever safer sex pamphlet that was really tailored towards gay men, that was meant in a sense that was more positive and pleasure focused, while also providing kind of important health information. We call that Playfair. And then we've kind of done other kind of fundraising efforts throughout the decades, largely related to AIDS organizations, but we've now kind of expanded into all forms of sex positivity.
I love that. And how long have you been a member of the Sisters?
I've been a member for about 14 years now. I initially joined back in 2010 and became fully professed in 2011.
Professed, I assume that's the initiation word, right? You become
Yes,
professed?
exactly. Yes, we have a very rigorous
Fabulous.
initiation process, and then you become fully professed after kind of demonstrating your commitment to the community at large.
I love that. I remember living in San Francisco doing the Easter celebrations, and the sisters would always be there. And I think it plays on this, obviously, the religious overtones, but what's so fabulous about it is it's so campy and over the top and sexy. I mean, a lot of times it can be quite sexy.
Oh,
I
yeah.
love that.
Yeah. I mean, so Easter is our anniversary. It's the first day that four sisters put on habits and kind of went out to the street. They had done other forms of street theater up until that point. It was really kind of these nuns' habits that really polarized the community in a way that kind of got people excited. And I think a lot of that's going back to kind of some forms of religious trauma or just religious affinity. But again, kind of tailoring it and filtering it through this lens of kind of being the holy fool and bringing in kind of tongue-in-cheekness. But Easter is our claim to fame. We host the Hunky Jesus and now the Foxy Mary contest as well. And we encourage people to be as fun and creative and sexy and flirtatious as they want to be. And it's always fun
Gosh,
seeing what people interpret that to be in, again, a very kind of positive and affirming way.
I love that so much. And did you grow up in a religious household? You mentioned trauma. I'm just
No,
curious.
yeah.
Ah,
My dad's side of the family is Jewish. My mom's side of the family was kind of more Protestant, but it was never an issue within me growing up. Neither of my parents were super religious. My mom was more spiritual, and so I was able to kind of dabble around and kind of figure out what it is that excited me. And I've always had an affinity for kind of the structure and the ritual related to a lot of kind of organized religion, but specifically the dogma and a lot of the kind of shame-based approach is never something that's resonated with me. And seeing growing up being gay and seeing kind of a lot of my peers and kind of generations ahead of me who are kind of processing a lot of that, I knew that this was something that I could do that kind of helps reclaim a way that kind of feels holistic and loving and joyful and pleasure based.
how did you at first encounter the sisters?
I think I first encountered them at Easter. Again, not really even knowing that it was their actual gig, but it was just kind of Easter in the park. Everyone goes. You go for the contests. But wasn't until several years later that I met a sister outside of Habit at the work-based training that both of us were going to called the San Francisco Sex Information, which was kind of tailored towards sex educators to be better sex educators and be able to sit on talk on phone lines and chats in order to answer questions. And so we kind of instantly clicked because we were just these two kind of queer weirdos within this sea of already fabulous queer people. But we just instantly meshed. And so at that time, they were explaining kind of what they were going through because they were one of a few sisters that went and took communion at one of the Catholic churches here in the city in Habit, and that got national attention. And so they
I,
were in the process of processing that. And so it was fun kind of being on the reflexive end of that and just holding space for his sister to be able to kind of have their own form of a confessional instead of the sister hearing the confessional, which is usually what we do throughout their community.
Mhm. And before the sisters, where did you grow up? Situate me in that, because you're in San Francisco
Yeah.
now. Are you from there?
I'm from the Bay Area. I grew up down on the peninsula and then went to undergrad down in Santa Cruz and then immediately moved up to San Francisco after that. My undergrad degree was in something called community studies, which was unique to our campus, but it allowed you to kind of go into a predetermined kind of community at large, working with a nonprofit. You did a 6-month full-time internship, and you pretty much audited that organization to see if they were kind of truly meeting the needs of their mission statement as well as kind of the community that they were focused to serve. And so my focus was on sex, gender, and sexuality. And I came up to San Francisco to intern with the Center for Sex and Culture with
Oh,
Dr.
with
Carol
Carol
Queen
Queen.
and Robert
Ah,
Lawrence. Yes. Yeah.
love her.
And so yeah, I was like immediately new to the city and immediately diving into like kind of the wealth of different sexual communities here in San Francisco. And it was an amazing experience to really kind of see and be exposed to a lot of different communities that I hadn't already been part of. because much of my personal experience was largely kind of in the gay male experience, and the Center for Sex and Culture was everything. And so it was
Ran the
lovely to kind
gamut.
of get that
Yep.
exposure, and kind of learn the ins and outs of San Francisco sexuality.
Yeah, there's really no place like it in the United States, at least when it comes to sex. It's kind of the hub of so much
Right.
cultural, political activism when it comes to sex. What was it like growing up in that environment? As a queer person, it must be like a treasure trove.
You would think so. I think as soon as you get outside of San Francisco and kind of down onto the peninsula, I think the general pulse is still more liberal than not. But growing up, it was kind of in the suburbs, and it was definitely much more of a kind of quasi-conservative. I grew up, in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, and didn't really hit my sexual maturity until kind of the early 2000s. And my uncle passed away about a few months before I was born from AIDS-related complications.
Oh,
And
God.
he was my mom's best friend. And she was super supportive and loved the fact that he was out and gay and lived in San Francisco for long periods of time. But the kind of trauma of losing her brother in such a kind of traumatic way definitely kind of filtered down to my experience growing up and kind of feeling like being gay meant you were going to get HIV, meaning you're going to kind of die from AIDS related complications. And even
Interesting.
though I was maturing at a time where we had kind of medications and like it was no longer seen as this death sentence, there was still kind of generations of kind of personal trauma that was happening there that I still had to kind of navigate, which I think kind of turned me off to wanting to be explicitly sexual in a lot of ways. And I turned that into wanting to learn everything I could about it. And so that's what kind of drove me to being more of an activist and being more of a sex educator, was really to kind of like take control of this so that I felt more comfortable kind of navigating it myself.
I can relate to that so much. I remember going to the gay bar early days in the 90s,
Mhm.
and I remember the song came on, I'm horny, 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 horny. And
Mhm.
I remember my little 17-year-old self or whatever thinking, why is everything about sex? And just feeling some kind of way about it. And then
Uh-huh.
really discovering the wonder and beauty of sex and not just the sort of negative things that come with it. And what was that exploration like for you of turning from, that kind of traumatic origin
Yeah,
to having great, hopefully the
right.
best sex?
um I think for me, like trying to, again, being a little bit of a control freak and a little bit of a Virgo, I like wanted to kind of dip my toes in ways that I felt comfortable with it. And so my early explorations were mostly as a voyeur, and really just kind of like watching other couples. And I loved that. It was
Yeah.
able to kind of see and learn all the different kind of ins and outs of how to pleasuring a partner, how to receive pleasure, without having to kind of technically be involved in it beyond just watching.
How did you
And that
find those experiences?
largely online. These were back in the days before the apps. So this was kind of like gay.com.
Hmm.
I think Manhunt was around at that point. Craigslist. Craigslist
Craigslist.
was a big one for sure. And it was like Craigslist was great because you were able to put up the specific ad in the posting that you were looking for. And so you were able to kind of set those terms in a way that was much easier to navigate than I think we've kind of evolved into with the apps and things like that. The apps are great for just kind of listing your yes and no's, but it's not the same as kind of crafting the whole scene, which I felt was kind of more tailored to what I was able to find on Craigslist.
Yeah, there's kind of a fantasy aspect of Craigslist
Hmm.
where you like really lay it out in kind of
Yeah,
clear terms. Yeah, it's creative in a way that
yeah, right.
Grinder and Manhunt or whatever, it's not the same. It's static.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like, there's much more of an instant gratification that can happen with Grinder and Scruff and Sniffies and all the rest, which is wonderful and great, and I love that in a lot of ways. But there is something about the kind of the mystery and the build up that I feel like happened more with Craigslist and some of our other apps, and
Oh, there was a
well
lot of
before that.
mystery.
Oh, yes.
Always mystery.
For sure.
So you're watching, you're learning.
Mhm.
Are these gay couples that you're watching?
Yes. At least in the early days. Yeah, earlier years it was only gay couples, and eventually I started kind of seeing a couple that I would kind of go and watch every so often, and it became kind of a more of a routine thing. And eventually kind of got invited into the actual scene. And that's where I kind of had felt like I'd already established a little bit of a connection there, and then felt comfortable kind of dipping my toes into it more. And that then led to me finally kind of feeling more comfortable kind of engaging with other people. And early on, it was almost exclusively men. And then when I moved up to San Francisco and started again interning with the Center for Sex and Culture, they were hosting much more kind of these like pansexual parties, and you were seeing a lot of different kind of bodies and genders and expressions and all of that. And that I loved even more because again, it like exposed me to things that I wouldn't naturally have gravitated towards, or thinking that's kind of what it is that I want or interested in. And it allowed me to kind of continue to be that voyeur when I needed, because I was able to see and witness and kind of participate in that capacity, which then led to me kind of more engaging in a variety of different sexual activities with different partners, different bodies, different genitals, all of it.
I
And
love
that's
all
what I,
the
yeah.
possible combinations of the world.
Oh, yes.
What, what how did you find? I'm just curious, like that first experience, like
Mhm,
watching. How did
mhm,
you range? You range that online, but like, what was the experience like for you?
mhm.
Did you know that you were just going to watch going in?
Yes. I knew that I was just going to watch going in, and there was that level of comfort that was there. At the same time, it was still going over to a stranger's house. They, the couple had a very, very young child,
Oh,
who was obviously not part of the scene. They were not there at the time. But I went to their house and they gave me instructions to like come through the backyard because they had like their bedroom had a patio, which then had like full glass windows. And so I was able to sit on the patio on outside and just kind of watch them. And I remember
oh,
walking
from a
in,
distance.
yeah, well, from a distance in that like, yeah, there was like the glass screen door was there, but it was still very close in proximity. But right, it was kind of like watching a window show. And so it was nice because I felt like then if I needed to, I could leave at any time. Um, but I do remember walking in and immediately tripping over one of the kids' like toys in the backyard and like stumbling my way in, and of course like making a huge noise as I'm doing so, and I'm like, well, there goes the fantasy. But
That's reality though. It's
yeah,
always, it's never
yeah,
quite a fantasy.
exactly. But yeah, I loved it. I mean, they had a red light on, so that kind of added to it. And it was just yeah, like growing up, I of course had seen porn and had kind of plenty of material that way, but it's nothing compares to seeing it in person and seeing a
Yeah.
couple that's like knows each other's bodies in a way that like is already super pleasurable and are excited about having someone else watch them. So there was kind of these extra layers from an early experience that was really quite lovely.
Yeah. I think a lot of young people would benefit from watching.
Mhm. Right?
And old people too. We would all
Yeah.
benefit from watching because you can learn something. Um, is that something you fantasize specifically about beforehand, or I'm just
I
you
would
know that's
say,
what you wanted to do?
yeah. I mean, I've always considered myself more of like an introvert in general. And so I think early on, kind of the key things of kind of getting better at sex and having a rich and fulfilling sex life has been able to navigate and communicate my wants and my needs. And early on, being super introverted, being kind of very fear-based, like communication was one of the hardest things for me. And so I was like, I'm not going to be able to communicate my needs and my boundaries or any of that. And so I think doing this in a way that I've already pre set up everything, which is mostly just watching, was really the helpful step of kind of like, again, slowly dipping my toe in things that finally felt comfortable and enriching. And that's when I really realized that I do enjoy watching. I mean, I love actual activity and kind of getting involved as well, but there's something so beautiful about just bearing witness.
What is it about bearing witness? I don't have a lot of experience. I mean, I've seen a lot of
Mhm.
sex myself,
Mhm.
but it never occurred to me as a young
Uh-huh.
person. Like that just was not something that I thought was
Yeah.
possible when I was learning about sex.
Um, I mean, I think again, it kind of connects back to this whole ministry of presence with sisters as well. Um, I think again, growing up, a lot of us had to, specifically within kind of the larger queer community, we had to kind of blunt ourselves. We had to like kind of hide ourselves. And so bearing witness and kind of being present and like seeing someone expressing themselves in the way that they're super excited about and probably haven't been able to or are finally able to as a sexual adult. There's something just so fun and enriching. And, you know, obviously finding exhibitionists who are equally as excited about showing off. Um, yeah, for me, there's just something so beautiful about that kind of that level of dynamic and interaction. Um, yeah, I'm not sure I can put it into words beyond it's yeah, I just love it.
No, I hear that it's something that's beyond words. It's like transcendental or something mystical. It's something magical. I don't know, but
Right.
I definitely get that aspect of sex is hard to describe. What were your first forays into like actually having sex like? What was that like for you?
Yeah. I all of my partners were much older than me. That was another thing for me that just felt more comfortable and safe. There was some level of a mentorship there as well. Um, and through that, again, just kind of met up with, I had two or three guys that I would kind of see on a somewhat routine basis. Um, and it started off with, you know, mostly just heavy petting, making out, hand jobs, all the rest, a massage, kind of exploring each other's body. And then kind of finally kind of developed into more kind of penetrative activities and whatnot. Um, you know, early on, I didn't really use any terms of top or bottom or anything like that, and was mostly just kind of there to kind of experiment and explore and try things out. There was always the kind of overwhelming or kind of hanging over your head, this kind of fear of HIV. And so I think that kind of pushed me away from doing a lot of kind of penetrative sex for long periods of time. And then PrEP kind of completely revolutionized that in kind of beautiful, beautiful ways, as
Blew the
Damon has
lid
already
off it.
talked
Yeah.
about. Exactly, right? Um,
I remember in San Francisco back in the day, there was a lot of uh, oral play and
uh-huh,
non-penetrative play, and I think that was
uh-huh,
part of that legacy of that now there's so much. It's just like bam, all the time, bam,
yep,
bam, bam, bam,
yep,
bam, and it
yep.
almost feels like we've lost a little bit of something. I don't know. Do you feel that way?
I do. Though I have been quite, you know, I think people are really polarized about the term side, or kind of the role of side. But I personally have loved seeing that kind of take its time in the spotlight. Because I think it, right, like so much of it is focused around penetration, and don't get me wrong, I love it as well, but there is something equally as beautiful and equally as pleasurable and kind of fun and kind of like then mystical about exploring other ways of being sexually active together, that doesn't always require penetration.
Yeah, I remember years ago, I met up with a guy who had never watched porn
Hmm.
and did not engage in penetrative sex.
Yeah.
And at first, I was like, oh, I don't know, this is probably not
Uh-huh.
going to be great. And then it was this just mind blowing experience, I think,
Totally.
because there were no scripts in
Hmm.
place. It
Hmm.
was just our bodies. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
I can't really describe it in words, but I appreciated the reminder and the power
Totally.
of non-penetrative sex.
Totally. I think it's something also that's what kind of reminding me of is that, in being in these kind of pansexual play spaces, there were plenty of kind of people that I was watching and kind of bearing witness to who I personally probably wouldn't want to actively engage with beyond kind of just watching. But a lot of that then meant that there was like a lots of just kind of mutual masturbation that was happening throughout these spaces. And being able to masturbate with a partner who you're not exactly kind of interested in kind of penetrative sex with, but also kind of loving and exploring them, kind of pleasuring themselves or kind of watching them do something else was also equally as fun and engaging. And especially, at the time, like seeing kind of other genders kind of exploring themselves and seeing how other genders are kind of doing sex that's not exactly penetrative, was this kind of wealth of San Francisco underbelly that I just love. And it's through San Francisco.
Uh-huh. I remember it well. That was a fun 2 years when I lived there, for sure. And a lot of times I feel like, at least, that I've learned some of the most valuable lessons about
Mhm.
sex from having bad sex.
Yes.
Are there experiences like that that you can remember that were like, oh God, it went bad, but you walked away feeling like, you
Yeah.
know, a
Yeah.
little enlightened?
Right. I think the thing that comes most pertinent to me is kind of early on, in coming up to San Francisco. I was living in a kind of queer collective household, that was known for throwing lots of sex parties. And being the host of the parties, you were always there, which was fine, and I loved that. But I was still hadn't kind of fully come to owning my boundaries. And so I still remember kind of early on kind of being engaged with people who were probably a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more, either under the influence of certain substances, where it just made it harder for me to kind of truly feel comfortable voicing my, oh, nope, this is passing a boundary. Let's pause here. And I found myself just kind of remaining quiet in a lot of those times, and kind of just going through with something in order to kind of get it done. And it, of course, didn't feel great in the moment. Of course, afterwards, it felt even worse because there's like levels of kind of shame and guilt there. But it did eventually kind of lead to me to being like, oh, like, no, like body autonomy is an important aspect of what I view as sexuality, as is consent, as is kind of pleasure. And so all of that needs to happen through communication. And I just need to kind of develop my communication skills and saying what I do want and what I don't want, and hearing what my partner wants and hearing what my partner doesn't want. It's still something I'm learning and kind of developing, but it is one of the aspects that I think it's hard.
Yeah, it's a skill and a muscle you have to strengthen, which is, people think that saying yes or no is like easy peasy. And then the
Right.
reality of it is, of course, much more intense when you're face to face with another human being who is
Totally.
desiring you, and you want to be desired, obviously,
Hmm.
but you have to be able to set that boundary for yourself. Do you have any tips for, because really my dream for this podcast is
Uh-huh.
to help young people who are like little yous and little me's who are trying to figure out how to
Right.
set those boundaries for themselves. What do you think helps?
Um, I think finding your community, which I know is a very broad and kind of general overarching term, but like finding the people that are interested in exploring the same ways. And ideally, you can find like your mentors within that, because that's largely what I did. And I feel like the mentors kind of were the ones that helped ushered me through being more comfortable, being more sexual, being more engaged. And I feel like within kind of the subsets of our communities, there's pretty rigorous, uh, there's pretty rigorous mentors out there and kind of these little networks. And, it does take time to find that group that you really resonate with or connect with. Um, again, I'd always say personally going back and enjoying just watching or going to some place that you can kind of do activities that don't exactly or immediately need to be kind of hands-on, but kind of collectively uh, pleasuring yourselves in a way that feels wonderful.
Daddies are having a moment, obviously, but
Yes.
back in our day, there was so much
Mhm.
stigma around AIDS that I think
Mhm.
intergenerational stuff really got a bad rap.
Mhm.
Today, we're in a different place around that, but I still think, obviously, there's some intense stigma around intergenerational
Uh-huh.
sex and relationships generally. What what would you say? I mean, like, to a young person, not like you should have sex with an older person, but like,
Yeah.
what how how do you counsel someone who is like kind of feeling icky maybe about that?
Uh-huh. I always think of like you don't want history to repeat itself, but we don't know the history. And like I think a lot of older men have decades worth of lived experience. And that lived experience is so important and so critical in kind of helping pass along kind of the ins and outs and exactly what does work for you, what doesn't work for you. I think that intergenerational partners really kind of bring new flavor to the scene. It kind of inherently has some level of a mentorship involved with it. Granted, there's can be different forms of power dynamics that come into play there, but my richest and most wonderful relationships, both as friends and as sexual partners, have always been with people that are probably about 15, 20, 30 years older than me. And now that I'm kind of moving towards my 40s, I find myself also kind of mentoring some of our younger generations. And so that's been an interesting kind of shift of kind of being the younger one in the room to now being the one kind of solidly in the middle. And so,
I feel that deeply. The moment all the twinks start messaging you saying, "Hey, daddy," or whatever, you're like,
yep.
"Oh my God, daddy, is it time yet?" But it is time. And I've
Right.
come to appreciate that role. I resisted and resented it for a while.
Mhm.
But I think uh I just think about little gay me and how he really it did benefit and could have even more benefited from that kind of mentorship that you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
You remember any lessons specifically that older guys taught you?
Um, I mean, I think I was super lucky in that the first partners that I had were not so focused on penetration. And so I think kind of early on learning that penetration is not the end all be all for sex. Um, and to kind of like slow your roll, take your time, really explore. Um, that was something that was super helpful for me. Um, just because, right, like I think so much of it was focused on like, all right, who's going to be the top, who's going to be the bottom, let's get this done. Everything leading up to it is just kind of like quick little steps along the way, but the main goal is to penetration. And I think early on, kind of seeing other forms of sexuality and really kind of seeing how to receive pleasure and be pleasured that doesn't revolve around penetration. Uh,
Mhm. That's great. My memory, I have a specific memory is living in San Francisco. Actually, I was hooking up with this guy who was much older than me at the time,
uh-huh.
and he taught me. Sounds so stupid, but I really value it. He taught me to put lotion on my body after I take a shower, and
Hmm.
it has left my skin supple into my 40s, and I.
Love that.
But yeah, I mean, so I have started to really appreciate that daddies and older guys generally in our community
Mhm.
do have wisdom. I
Mhm.
am now one of those people, so I'm trying to appreciate what that can look like in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Um, because there is a lot of potential for unhealthiness in those
Of
relationships.
course,
How do
of
you
course.
navigate that?
Um, I mean, personally, I've usually met up with partners outside of a sexual setting first, whether it's just like a quick, simple little coffee break or somewhere out in the community, somewhere that doesn't feel kind of immediately charged and kind of setting up intentions and or expectations. And as long as there's kind of a vibe and there's good chemistry, then we kind of like quickly pivot more towards the bedroom.
Hmm.
Um, but because I've definitely, when you're crafting this fantasy, when you're chatting and you're flirting online for long periods of time and you build up these expectations and then you show up at their house and it's not exactly what you're looking for, that's always harder to navigate and harder to kind of get yourself out of versus if you like kind of initially just do a little kind of quicker touch base. Let's meet out in the community. Let's do something that feels more comfortable to really kind of suss out if this is actually going to be a good connection. Because our
Yeah,
online
that's really smart
personas are not
advice.
always the same as our in-person personas.
Yeah. Yeah, just the idea of meeting up with someone in at a bar or something. I used to do that a lot more than I do these days. Maybe
Hmm.
schedules are tough sometimes, but
Yes. Yes.
but I like that ideal a lot. I really
Right.
found it valuable as well. What does really amazing sex look like for you today?
Really amazing sex for me today. I have recently discovered the term symbiosexual, which is kind of receiving or enjoying kind of watching the dynamic of someone else and specifically other couples, which kind of gets rooted back to my early days as a mostly a voyeur. Um, and so that's mostly led to like my best sex has always been in group settings.
Mm.
Um, whether it's with another couple, I mean, the absolute best sex I've ever had was with a throuple, where everyone was verse and everyone was like both fun and playful as well as super into each other, which I know the sooner as when you add more people in, it's harder to make sure that there's like sexual chemistry across all partners. But for whatever reason, it worked. And it was fun to be able to kind of pair off into individual pairs and come back together, switch partners, do more of a group scene. Um, but yeah, I love kind of being in the midst of larger group dynamics, because it allows me to continue to be that voyeur, to bear witness, but also be engaged. Um, and it's just fun seeing how other people receive pleasure from other people to me.
Are these regular groups that happen in, same
Sometimes,
people?
usually if they're, like couples or people that I know, then yes, I would say kind of ongoing. But if it's more of like kind of either play parties or sometimes I'll go to this kind of gay men's sketching group where it's 2 hours of sketching. And most of the people that sketch, we take turns modeling as well. And then after 2 hours of lovely sketching, it usually devolves into a lovely social hour, which is sans clothes and very enjoyable. And so that changes the dynamic because every week there's different guys that show up, and sometimes it's regulars, and you'll kind of see them on recurrent days, and sometimes it's people's first time. And so it's nice to kind of welcome people into that group, and kind of and get meshed with someone. You can kind of go back and play with them on a recurring basis. And if it didn't work out that one time, you can maybe try some different partners. So it's nice to kind of mix it up in that regards.
Do you ever find that there's someone that you thought, I'm not going to get along with them at all, and then you just have this amazing encounter?
Yeah. And I find like that the group settings has really been helpful for me for that. I'll definitely like go into some of these sketch groups where I'm just like, all right, there's the one person that I definitely am excited about. And we'll just like, all of us will be without our clothes on and we'll be kind of starting to play and they'll like immediately beeline to someone else. And then you're just like, all right, well, it's not going to work out there. So let's kind of pivot and navigate. And so again, it's kind of these group settings. It kind of exposes me to people that I probably wouldn't have gravitated to online or kind of sought out individually. And then, you're in the dynamics of sex and you're realizing that they're quite skilled at certain things. And uh, you kind of take beauty in that and kind of realize that, your instant kind of viewing of them might not have been the most reliable in terms of really enjoyable sexual partners.
Yeah, there's something that can happen where you just realize sexual attraction to someone. You didn't see it at first, but then they
Mhm.
smile a certain way or they unbutton a button or whatever. And it's like,
Mhm.
oh, I
Right,
see you now.
right.
Y-
My early, oh,
Yeah.
I think my kind of early experiences playing with trans men was a lot of that as well, where like I knew that like my attraction was mostly to kind of like masculine identified individuals, um, and kind of being in play spaces that were kind of gender explorative and gender inclusive.
So one of the beautiful things about the in-person kind of drawing class thing is that you
Mhm.
can kind of see people visually in ways that they would not present themselves online, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Exactly. And like when you're drawing them, you're kind of enjoying the beauty of like this specific curve in their body. And it's like not always focused just on the genitals. And you can kind of like really appreciate, the way that the light is hitting their clavicle or, the little dimple on their backside. And I think that you can kind of find the beauty in those little things that you wouldn't not normally kind of gravitate towards that really makes me excited to explore their bodies more fully after drawing sessions. Um, and yeah, it's not always focused just around the genitals.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for, because online, obviously you lose that ability.
Mhm.
I know you said you meet people beforehand, but before you even made up, are there ways that you try to assess people's vibe? Is that word? I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I usually like I know some people and no shame to it. Like they want to just like they use the apps to get in, get out. They want, they don't want the banter, they don't want the chat. They just want to know what you want. They want to set it up and they want to get going. And for me, like I actually enjoy getting to know them and kind of enjoy kind of like fleshing out the personality behind the body. Because that's going to be more key and that's going to be more sexy and more engaging to me than, just the standard body itself. And, of course, every so often, that's actually just what I want is just a quick hookup. And so that's lovely too. But that always comes with some level of, is the actual dynamic going to be there? Is the actual dynamic going to be comfortable? So I just have to kind of be willing to roll the dice sometimes, and, you know, maybe not have the best of connections initially and just hope that the sexual attraction will kind of push me through it. But usually I like to kind of, you know, get to know them on some level before kind of immediately jumping into the sheets.
And you mentioned the symbiosexual. Is that
Hmm.
this?
Yep.
Yeah, this is a term I'm actually not familiar with. What what does that term do for you that's different from voyeur?
Um, I think it's more specific about enjoying the dynamic of another couple. And so like a voyeur can just be like it could just be one single person. And the symbiosexual is like really loving the like loving dynamic between a predetermined couple and kind of getting sexual gratification from that. And so I think it's to me it's just like another layer onto voyeur, where voyeur is kind of this broad term of watching anything versus kind of the symbiosexual, which is like really enjoying the watching the dynamic of this other couple, and you're getting specific pleasure from that and kind of engaging with that too.
And it sounds like you're also watching couples that are not gay men now.
Yes. Yeah. Again, largely through kind of these play parties that are kind of welcoming of everyone and everybody. Really seeing kind of ways that not all gay men, but kind of the larger trans umbrella, straight couples, queer couples within the kind of, gender non-conforming, non-binary, all of that. Um, yeah.
Has that changed your attraction?
Yes, I think so. I'm still mostly attracted to kind of displays of masculinity or kind of masculine characteristics. But I have a lot of loving and wonderful kind of trans masculine partners. So for me, the attraction in sex is not specifically to a cock or to a penis. It's kind of the display of masculinity, and that's exploring that through having partners who are trans has been amazing and wonderful. Um, I lived in a larger queer household, separate from the one that I mentioned earlier, that was largely female. For long stretches of time, I was the only kind of male identified individual in the house. And it was all queer. It was kind of so being kind of immersed in largely kind of femme focused sexuality made me love and appreciate a lot of kind of femme identified bodies as well, and see how sex is navigated and explored in different contexts outside of just the gay male experience. So I always have a strong affinity for that too.
Yeah, I remember going to the bar on Castro with my friend who was a trans guy. This was back in the early 2000s. And
Mhm.
there would always be like, he would be making out with someone within 30 seconds instantly. He was so handsome and is so handsome to this day. And I remember, time would go on and then there would be the moment where the disclosure would happen. And, it's interesting. Even back in the early 2000s, I would say most times it was fine. Guys were like, fuck yeah, let's do it. And I loved that. I think he was systematically educating the Castro about trans
Oh,
bodies
totally.
back then.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, I worked at a sex club here in San Francisco for several years, and I'd say at least half of my coworkers were trans men. And it was amazing seeing this like sex club that is tailored towards men, who was like all inclusive of kind of the kind of larger umbrella of male bodies, including kind of trans men. And so that was just fun, kind of being part of that network. And we would host occasional workshops tailored towards like cis men pleasuring trans bodies and trans men pleasuring cis bodies. And it was really fun kind of being in these safer spaces where people could ask questions that they don't always feel comfortable doing with an individual partner, and not feeling judged for it, and really kind of helping to expand their idea of what it means to be sexually attracted to kind of the larger umbrella of men.
It's fabulous. I love that. I always like to end on a fun segment I call Sordid Lives and Untold Tales, or
Uh-huh.
SLUT for short.
Uh-huh.
What's the sluttiest thing you ever did?
I think it's, probably the recurrent sex parties that I've gone to and hosted at my houses over the years. That seems kind of the obvious or the easiest answer. I think outside of that, more recently, I had my very first kind of fisting experience, with, again, someone who was older than me, very, very experienced in fisting. And it was fun to just kind of explore that in a way that felt that I wasn't being judged, that I could kind of make some mistakes and feel comfortable with it. I really, really loved and learned that I enjoy being a fisting top. So, I think that's going to be a new foray into other experiences that I'm hopefully pursuing. Um, so yeah, I can say that was my
Love
other kind of sluttier moment as of most recently.
Yes, absolutely. I think fisting is in the post-prep world, it's one of those things that become more popularized, I think
Uh-huh.
it's fair to say. And people have become open to this
Right.
experience in a new way. I'd love to hear that. If people want to learn more about you and the work that you do, where could they find you?
So the first thing would be going to the Sisters website, which is thesisters.org. And that's for the San Francisco chapter, but that gives a good overview of kind of our history. You get to see who our individual members are. My personal social media on Instagram is sister_taint_a_virgin. But the website's probably the easiest way to kind of get a general understanding of who we are and how to get involved.
Thank you so much, sister.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening, as always. And remember, if you aren't having your best sex, I can help. My services as a sex coach are designed to help you identify and overcome the barriers that are standing between you and your best sex life. Find out more on my website, thebestgaysex.net. Till next time.